gentlemen, you are listening to Campfire Catholicism. I'm your host, Alton Jarvis. So glad to have you guys listening on the show either today or, well, whatever day you're actually listening to this. So I'm very, very glad to have you guys here. Recently, I've been getting a lot of feedback in regards to the podcast, and I would just like to say a very personal thank you to all the people that have personally contacted me so far. I really do hope that the content that I am putting out is, I was going to say intentional. I hope it's inspirational. There we go. That's the word that I want to use. I hope it's inspirational, and I hope that you can draw some things out of it. So I do appreciate all of your guys' feedback, so thanks a lot for that. And so you are listening to the very first episode of this Tolkien series that we are going to be doing, in which we are going to deconstruct the world of Middle-earth and all of the books that involve Middle-earth. So we're going to be talking about, well, the Silmarillion, The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings 1, 2, and 3, Beren and Luthien, and a bunch of Tolkien's other works, or as many of his works as we're going to talk about. I'm not going to be only just deconstructing it just out of my own POV, my own point of view and perspective, but I'm going to be drawing a lot of inspiration from Dr. Peter Kreeft, who wrote this amazing book called The Philosophy of Tolkien. If any of you guys want to go deeper into the Catholic lore of the Lord of the Rings, that may be the book for you, okay? So just wanted to put that out there. The very first thing that we are going to be talking about when we do talk about Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings, and this might seem complicated, but I tend to overcomplicate things a lot anyways, and a lot of people usually do at the same time. We just love the complexity of things and how things work. So we're going to be talking about metaphysics. Metaphysics is a fancy word, and when anybody talks about metaphysics, usually it talks about the nature of reality or the idea of God, well, which is also a part of understanding the nature of reality. Now, the topic about God is not a scientific one, although people do use science to prove or disprove God all the time, which you can't actually use science to prove or disprove God's existence. Rather, the idea of God is really a philosophical one that people should be debating, and people have been debating for, well, a long time, since, I guess, the cows come home, anyways, let's put it that way. The topic of God's existence has always been talked about. Well, philosophy, according to the dictionary, is the study of the fundamental nature of knowledge, reality, and existence. Knowledge could be best defined as an accumulation of data, skills, and facts, usually through experience or in education. But knowledge just by itself, and this is why I want to aspire towards wisdom, is because knowledge just by itself, sitting in just the wealth bank of your brain, will eventually collect dust, like the old tools in somebody's shed. And we know what happens with that. Sometimes rust can get in, and anyways. We are called to be wise and to be a people of wisdom. If knowledge is the accumulation of data, skills, and facts, then wisdom is the deepening understanding and the ability to use your knowledge in order to make sensible decisions and judgments. I once heard it was said that if knowledge is like the toolbox in the wealth bank of your brain, then wisdom is how you would use the tool in the situations that are given to you. So that's one way that we can look at it. And I love that word sensible. It almost seems that in our culture, we are becoming much less sensible as time goes on, and it almost seems as if there is a... Actually, I actually get into this later on in the episode, so I'm not going to spoil it right away. Now, going back to philosophy, though, one of the most important, if not the most important idea that philosophers contemplate about, which I did mention earlier, is the idea of the existence of God. To put it simply, the idea of this and metaphysics explores reality and all of reality, such as chemicals, history, morality, substances, etc. It seeks the truth and principles that are true of all reality. Some questions that can help us understand metaphysics, especially for some of you listeners that haven't been introduced to metaphysics. And I'm not saying that I am the greatest metaphysicist that has ever existed. I myself am also learning more about this topic even as I am recording this episode. But here are some questions that can help us be introduced to the idea of metaphysics. Well, we have one of the most important questions, if not the most important question. Is God real? Is evil real? Is matter real? Is spirit real? So those are questions that we can use to introduce ourselves to the idea of metaphysics. In Peter Kreeft's book, Philosophy of Tolkien, there are 3 metaphysical questions that are illuminated, which are the following. How big is reality? Is it smaller or bigger than our thought? Does it include the supernatural? That would be number 2. And number 3, does it include universals such as Platonic ideas? Now, because of time's sake, the only thing that we're going to explore in this episode is how big is reality? Is it smaller or is it bigger than our thought? Let's explore this. When this question is put up in the book Philosophy of Tolkien, Peter Kreeft says that there are 3 possible explanations or 3 possible answers that we can draw from this. And I'll do it in chronological order. Number 1, the first one being, again, the question is, how big is reality? Is it smaller or is it bigger than our thought? First option is, there are more things in heaven and on earth than in our thought, or what we could possibly dream of. We're going to call this viewpoint the happy man viewpoint. The second possible answer is that there are fewer things in heaven and on earth than in our thought. And a common way of thinking like this, we're going to call this the pessimistic man. And finally, the third possible answer is that there are exactly the same number of things in heaven and on earth and in our thought. And we're going to call this viewpoint the know-it-all viewpoint. There are 2 questions that I would like to ask you, the listener. Why is it important to know these viewpoints? Or another way of asking this could be, what difference does it make in belonging to one such way of thinking in the first place? Well, here's the issue. Like Peter Kreeft says in his book, it does make a total difference which viewpoint you do hold, and I don't even think we need a book to understand that. If you even just look at reality, or if you even just take a moment to examine and interpret just how not only life is, but the people that are in life and the decisions that they make. Perhaps some of you guys have friends that obviously we make decisions all the time, but perhaps those decisions are influenced by those factors of their viewpoints, of their perspectives, of their family of origin, you name it. A lot of our actions can be prescribed, or I guess that's the right word. It could be prescribed to what we have not only experienced in just our life, but that can involve the environment, or even the environment around us in that present moment. Our perspectives really do change how we look at the world. Even though it might not, in a sense, change the nature of reality, it definitely changes how we perceive and how we see reality around us. So, these viewpoints that I mentioned, we're going to go over the first one. That one being the happy man's viewpoint. It is the lens of looking at the world as bigger than you could have possibly imagined, which when we understand the depth of our own human consciousness, there is still much more to be found in us. That is a pretty big claim. Peter Kreeft uses this example. Picture yourself as a small child, and it's like you are in a very big house. And I love that example because why does he say that? Well, children, especially those of you that have young children that are listening to the show, children are known to be very curious, but they do so because there's a certain sense of awe and wonder that they go about their infant lives. It is to those young ones that Jesus Christ, said to his disciples, "Truly I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." This viewpoint is very important because it is what makes stories captivating. It breathes life into the heroes and their magnanimous virtue, and the villains with their abominable vices. You expect mysteries and mournous, terrors that stop your heart, but courage to fortify it, suffering that breaks your heart, but the joy to mend it. And even in this viewpoint, it even gives suffering meaning. And we're going to have another episode talking about the nature of suffering and is suffering intrinsically evil. We're going to be talking a bit about that. In this viewpoint, reality is simply big. And again, I say simply because we tend to love overcomplicating things, and I love overcomplicating things, again, because we like the complexity. But this is the happy man's viewpoint. It is the small child in a big house viewpoint of reality being much bigger than ourselves, and there is more to explore. And think about it, if any of you guys love watching movies like the Avengers, okay, the Avengers MCU, Marvel Cinematic Universe, for all those of you that don't understand what MCU stands for. When we watch those movies in that lens, in the life is much more bigger than us lens, it breathes more life into those stories, into their backstories, into decisions that they make, and the battles that are fought. It seems to me that there is much more meaning. Now let's go over the two other viewpoints. The lens of the pessimist, or the one that views that there are less things on earth and in heaven than in our thought. Now, this worldview causes the individual to become jaded, detached, cynical, skeptical, and the culmination of all of those, I'm going to use this word, is nihilistic. Nihilism is a family of views which express some form of negation towards life. Nihilistic positions can hold these positions, such as human values are baseless, life is meaningless, knowledge is impossible, and that there are entities that do not exist. One nihilistic philosopher, I don't know if he was entirely nihilistic, again, I haven't read his works, Friedrich Nietzsche, he is a philosopher of that kind, and I have not yet mustered the courage to read any of his work, but I would hope to do so. I've only heard Friedrich Nietzsche from other influencers that have been influenced by, that they were influenced by. So Friedrich Nietzsche influenced them. Anyways, let's continue on. Why is the worldview of nihilism dangerous? And this kind of goes towards even the third viewpoint, but I heard that it was once said that sin is the rationalization of insanity, or where the insanity becomes rational. In the nihilistic viewpoint, if you hold that all of life is meaningless, then it seems to me that you can justify practically anything under the sun, unless evidence is proven otherwise. And then, when we talk about evidence, we could even talk about subjective truth, and that's a whole other can of worms, and we're going to end up talking about that later on. The other dangerous thing about being a nihilist and having a nihilistic worldview is because you become a reductionist. And I'll give you some examples of what reductionism looks like. Sacrificial love is just reduced to blind passion and emotion. Moral ideals just become simple impulses, electrons or neurons just firing in your brain. A loving God just becomes a happy thought to satiate a person, a myth and nothing more than a myth, just to get you through happy days and prosperous days. That's certainly something to think about. Now, the third lens is that of the know-it-all, or in other words, we can call them the arrogant rationalist. This is what Pope Leo the 23rd had to say about rationalism. This is what he writes. No poison is more fatal to divine faith than the subtle and insidious spread of rationalism. Why is that the case? Again, it goes back to what I said just previously. Sin is the rationalization of the insanity. It repeats to us the same words that the serpent spewed at Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. You shall be like gods, knowing good and evil. This way of thinking can flatter our pride, and that's dangerous because who is somebody to say that whether they are prideful or not? And the answer is you don't know until retrospect, until it's, I guess, per se, too late. Even though it's never too late. And the eternal timeline, so long as we repent. Anyways, relativism also falls under the category, everything in my thought is real, and everything that is real is in my thought. I'm going to read that one more time. Relativism also falls under the category that everything in my thought is real, and everything that is real is in my thought. Do you understand the emphasis of me in that sentence? Again, goes back to what the serpent said to Adam and Eve, you shall be like gods. When in reality, when we attempt to do that, we, in a sense, become our own devils, and we enslave ourselves and torment ourselves in our own mind. So if we have this childlike lens in which we see the world that's much bigger than we could have ever imagined, let us shift gears into the idea about God. Does God exist? The question is the most interesting and important question in the world for most people. And here's the thing, God's existence or non-existence makes a difference for everything, since God is the creator and designer, which therefore leads to him being the ultimate explanation for everything. So where can we find God in the world of the Lord of the Rings? Well, we can start at looking at the Silmarillion, in which he is explicitly mentioned in that book. On the first page of the Silmarillion, which I have, it is written, there was Eru, the one who in Arda is called Iluvatar. But wait, he isn't mentioned in the Lord of the Rings, so how is he in the Lord of the Rings? Well, let's internalize and analyze that a little bit more. So he's explicitly mentioned in the Silmarillion, which is the creation book of the Lord of the Rings, and not to mention, it also has the first and the second ages of Middle Earth in that book as well, just the history and what goes on. We're going to talk a little bit about pantheism. So pantheism is the New Age way of looking at the idea of God. And C.S. Lewis actually writes about the differences between pantheism and theism. Theism, believing that you believe in the God, the Christian one. There are things which God is not. In that sense, he has a determinate character. Thus, he is righteous, not immoral, creative, and not inert. The Hebrew writings here observe that once God says simply, I am, proclaiming the mystery of self-existence, but times without number he says, I am the Lord. I, the ultimate fact, have this determinate character, and not that. And men are exhorted to know the Lord, to discover and experience this particular character. When people subscribe to pantheism, in that God is the universe, or the universe is eternal, this God is not a relational one, and he is not a personal one. He will not pursue you, and to that, there is no reason to actually be wholly fearful of him. To say that the pantheistic God is true, then, that would mean all images of God's kingship is just one big historical accident. And yet we still find a huge number of people seeking to preserve this, seeking to preserve the image of God's kingship. Why is that? Could perhaps God be personal? could he actually care about me intimately? Does he really know the number of hairs on my head, or when I sit down and when I stand up? That's the question. The reality is there is no human author in history that has ever successfully portrayed God as a personal and dramatic character. That's why we have the Bible. Only the Bible did that. Even the Old Testament of the Bible did it with anthropomorphic inadequacies. That is, having human traits and characteristics. But when we look at the New Testament, this anthropomorphism is overcome like this. Who would have conceived or thought for our God, the creator of the universe, to become a man? Jesus Christ is the most dramatic character in Western civilization. I'm going to say that again. Jesus Christ is the most dramatic character in Western civilization, if not the whole world. Yet people will bring up this objection that Jesus is just simply a human invention, just man's fiction. But could it be that it's not just man's fiction or myth, but rather God's fact or truth? I am the Lord. That's what our Lord says. There is no human author after the Gospels that depict Jesus perfectly. There are only two that off the top of my head stand out, and Peter Kreeft also mentions this in the Philosophy of Tolkien. Those of you that know the Chronicles of Narnia, or are fans of the Chronicles of Narnia, we have the character Aslan. And, Narnia, that story in general is a good allegorical piece of work in which we can attempt to understand the mystery of Christianity through the use of story. And I will be doing an episode series on the Chronicles of Narnia in the future. Here's a second story that I have not got to fully read yet. The second being Fyodor Dostoevsky's portrayal of the Grand Inquisitor, which you can find that in The Brothers Karamazov. Apparently that book is very, very deep, and so I'm very excited to read this. I'm going to make a shout out to a man named Joe Shev who got me a copy this past Christmas. I'm looking forward to reading it. Going back to where is God in The Lord of the Rings, this is the answer. Tolkien does not portray God in The Lord of the Rings explicitly, as he does in the Silmarillion. But what he does do is he portrays Christ figures in The Lord of the Rings. What do I mean by that? There's a great number of Christ figures in The Lord of the Rings, because if we just take a look at even our life, or the Christian life and the Catholic life, we are called to be like the Lord by our baptismal calling. We're called to be imitators of Jesus. And we see many imitators of Jesus in this book. For in Catholic theology, Jesus Christ is the mind of the author, or the conception of him which we know to be called the Logos, the inner word of God, just as St. John writes in his gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so I'm going to finish off with just this idea that we can contemplate. If the Lord of the Rings is filled with many Christ-like figures, well then, we can look at the story and say what Christ-like figures are present in the story. Well, you have some more literal allegorical ones, such as a lot of people tend to really, what's it called? I was gonna say subtract, but that's they take out, or they shine the light. There we go. I'm really trying to form my words. They shine the light on Gandalf, Aragorn, and Frodo, almost as if it's priest, prophet, and king. So you have Frodo as the priest, and he's making the offering. He's offering the ring to cast it into Mordor, as in a sense, you could call that a sacrifice, and it is a sacrifice because he has to journey and he has to carry the burden almost as if it's like Christ carrying the cross. Aragorn, he's Christ's kingship, the kingly Lord that eventually restores, you could even allegorically see it, like the New Jerusalem, okay? And then we have Gandalf, that is the prophet. He is the one he's speaking into the world and is making things work, forming alliances with people. You see in how he acts as if he is a prophet. But, I would say that every good character in I'm thinking of the film, in the book series The Lord of the Rings, that shows virtue as a Christ-like figure. And we're going to have more episodes talking about this more, but I'll give you some ideas to contemplate about. Merry and Pippin's friendship is certainly one in which we can see the Christ-like figure act in both of those individuals. Same thing with Frodo and Sam. And my goodness, Samwise Gamgee in that book and the movie. He is a very prominent Christ-like figure and an imitation of Christ. You have Éowyn, the woman that defeats the Witch King. She represents a Christ-like figure in some senses. Even Boromir is an image of a Christ-like figure. Any of those individuals that display some sense of virtue also display Christ. Again, going back to what was said before, is that we're all called to be like Christ and to love him and to be perfect just as he is perfect. And so therefore, God makes himself known through our actions. And so I guess the one question that I want to end off with is that, well, two things. One, do I live in the worldview in a childlike lens while still being wise and still being rational? Do I live to be childlike not only in my faith but in the way that I see the world and reality as much bigger than myself? If I don't see the world that way, well, what worldview do I hold? Am I a nihilist? Am I just an arrogant rationalist? Perhaps there are other sub-viewpoints that you could fall into. And number two, thinking about the characters of the Lord of the Rings. Am I being a Christ-like figure to the people around me? Do I not only live compassionately, do I live in truth, and do I communicate that charitably as well? Not only by my words, but majoritarily by my actions? And if I haven't, well, what is preventing me from doing so? Because here's the thing, ladies and gentlemen, while we continue to deconstruct the Lord of the Rings and the beautiful book that it is and the story that it is, the real story that we are living in right now is the life of history. Our history and the history of the world, and how we can partake in it and participate in it in the greatest way possible. So thank you so much, guys, for listening to the show. Please continue to listen to it on Spotify. I also just got it approved for Apple Music, so any of you Apple lovers out there can go on Apple Music, and it should be on there as well. If not, feel free to let me know, and we'll see what we can do there. That being said, looking forward to having you guys back here on the show, listening into more videos. Again, you've been listening to Campfire Catholicism. I am your host, Alton Jarvis. Take care, guys. Have a wonderful rest of your day.